Welcome back to Shadows of Black History, the channel where the forgotten dead are handed back their names, and the stories men tried to bury claw their way up through the soil. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, your city, your country, and the hour on your clock. It humbles us to see how far into the dark these stories travel. If tonight's story moves something in you, subscribe and tap the like button so it can reach someone else who needs to hear it. Tonight we go down into the low country, to a rice plantation long since swallowed by marsh and time, where in the autumn of 1849, a crowd of men decided to hang a giant from a live oak tree. They called him an animal. They called him the ox. They measured him at 8.5 feet and still could not make him small. They believed a rope and a shouting crowd would be the end of him. They were wrong. Because when that rope snapped, something came down out of that tree that the low country has never stopped whispering about. Something the living were not meant to wake. This is the story of the giant they called Titus, and the night hell came down off the branch with him. They sold Titus off the block at the river landing on a grey morning, and folks said the auctioneer's voice shook the whole time he spoke. He was chained at the wrists and the ankles, and again around the waist, 3 sets of iron, because 1 set had not been enough on the boat. Even bent under all that metal, his head rose above every free man in the crowd. When he straightened, the buyers went quiet, the way a field goes quiet before a storm. Ambrose Devereux bought him. Devereux owned the rice ground out past the Black Water, a long stretch of flooded fields where men worked to their knees in mud, and the fever took 2 or 3 every season. He was a soft-handed man who had never done a hard thing himself in his life, and he liked the idea of owning the largest man anyone had ever seen. He paid more than he could afford. He told the men around him that he had just bought a whole team of hands in one body. But an old woman named Aunt Sissy was there that morning, carried down to the landing to mind a white child, and she saw what the buyers did not. She watched Titus lift his head and look out over the river, out past the boats, out to where the water met the sky. And she said later that she felt the ground tilt under her feet, the way it does when a grave opens somewhere you cannot see. She went home, and she did not sleep. She told the people in the quarter that Devereux had not bought a man. She said he had bought a debt, and that debts in this world always come to be paid. Titus came to the plantation, and he worked, and the work he did should not have been possible. He carried the floodgates that 4 men set together. He pulled a loaded flat off a sandbar with a rope over his shoulder while the mule stood there blowing and useless. He never complained of the heat, never slowed in the wet, and the fever that emptied the other cabins never once touched him. That last part frightened people more than his size did. He spoke little. When he did, his voice came from somewhere low in his chest, slow like water moving under ice. In the evenings, he would sit at the edge of the quarter with his back to the tree line and hum. No words, just a deep tune that nobody recognized and that everybody somehow felt they had heard before. Dogs would not go near him. The overseer's hounds, mean as they were, would lie down flat and whine when he passed. Aunt Sissy watched all of it. She was a conjure woman, older than anyone could count, and she read the world the way other people read weather. She noticed that the marsh birds went silent when Titus walked the dike, and that the crickets picked up again only after he had gone. One night, She pressed a little pouch of roots into his enormous hand, protection, the kind she gave to men marked for trouble. Titus looked at the pouch for a long time. Then he closed her small fingers back around it and shook his head gently and gave it back. He told her she would need it more than he would. And Aunt Sissy, who feared nothing under the sun, went cold all the way down to her feet. The grown people gave Titus room, but the children ran to him like water runs downhill. They were not afraid of a thing about him. He would set the smallest ones up on his shoulders, so they could see clear across the flooded fields to the river. And from up there, they said, the world looked like something God had only just finished making. He plaited reeds into little marsh horses for them. He learned all their names in a week, which was more than the overseer had done in years. There was a boy named Reuben, maybe 7 years old, small for his age, with a bad cough that the flooded fields made worse. Titus took to that boy. He would carry Reuben on his shoulder down the dike in the cool of the morning so the child could breathe better up high above the water. He would tell him things in that low, slow voice. Nobody ever heard what. And the boy would laugh, and it was the only laughing sound in that whole terrible place. The overseer, a lean and bitter man named Merritt Cade, saw the children laughing, and it turned something sour in his gut. A frightened field was a quiet field, and quiet was what kept him safe. But laughter was a different thing. Laughter meant hope, and hope was the one crop Cade had been hired to make sure never grew. He began to watch the giant, and the more he watched, the more he understood that he was afraid. And a cruel man who is afraid is the most dangerous animal there is. It happened over Reuben, the way Aunt Sissy always said it would. The boy fell behind, carrying seed one hot afternoon, coughing so hard he could not keep his feet. And Merritt Cade rode down the dike with his whip already loose in his hand. He said the boy was lazy. He said he would beat the lazy out of him. He raised his arm. The whip never came down. A shadow fell across the whole dike, and when Cade turned, Titus was standing there. Not fast, not angry, just there, the way a wall is there. He did not touch the overseer. He did not say a word. He simply reached down with one hand, lifted the coughing child as easy as lifting a lamp, and held him against his chest. Then he looked at Cade, and whatever was in that look made the overseer's horse back up 3 steps on its own. For a long moment, the two of them stayed like that, the mounted white man with his whip and the giant with the child. Every hand in that field had stopped working. Every one of them was watching, though they kept their eyes low. Cade's mouth worked, but nothing came out. In the end he laughed, a thin, ugly sound that fooled no one, coiled his whip, and told them all to get back to work. He rode off. But the thing that had held that plantation together, the thing older than any fence, the belief that fear was stronger than a man's own soul, had cracked clean down the middle, and everybody standing in that field had heard it break. Merritt Cade rode straight to the big house and did not wait to be announced. He told Ambrose Devereux that the giant had defied him in front of the whole field, that the hands were changing, that a thing had gotten loose that could not be allowed to spread. Devereux poured himself a drink with a hand that would not stay steady, and told the overseer he was seeing ghosts. The giant had broken no tool, raised no hand, spoken no word of rebellion. There was nothing to punish. That was the trouble, Cade said. You cannot whip a man for standing still. And that was exactly why he was so dangerous. The others were beginning to look at Titus the way people look at a light in a long dark. And once they stopped being afraid, the whole plantation, the fields, the floodgates, the fortune Devereux had sunk into that mud. All of it came apart. Devereux went to his window that night and looked out toward the quarter. And there, at the edge of the tree line, he saw the giant sitting with his back to the forest, still as carved stone, humming that low tune. The wind carried all the way up to the house. Devereux stood at the glass a long time. He was a coward, and cowards understand better than brave men when they are in the presence of something that will not bend. He decided, standing there, that Titus had to die. Not quietly, publicly, so that every soul for 20 miles would learn the lesson in his blood. He did not know. How could he, that he was choosing the one death that would cost him everything? They needed a reason, and reasons were cheap. Kate said the giant had raised his hand to a white man. A lie. And everyone who had stood in that field knew it. But a lie with a rope behind it does not need to be true. Word went out. A slave had risen against his master's authority, and he would hang for it on Devereux's own, crowned from the great live oak that stood at the bend of the river road, the oldest tree in the whole low country. People came from everywhere. That was the point. Planters brought their families in carriages. Rough men rode in from the turpentine camps. Peddlers set up along the road to sell to the crowd, because a hanging in those days drew people the way a fair did. They wanted to see the giant. They had heard the stories. 8.5 feet, the man the fever wouldn't take, the man the dogs would not bite. And they wanted to watch him die like anybody else, to prove to themselves that he could. In the quarter there was no sleep. The people knew what was coming, and could do nothing to stop it. But Aunt Sissy did a strange thing on the last night. She went cabin to cabin and told everyone, when the sun came up and they were made to stand at that tree, to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut, no matter what they saw. She said the giant was going to give them something before he left this world, and it was not going to look like a gift. She would not say more. She sat up until dawn, drawing marks in the dirt at her doorway that no one else could read. They kept Titus chained in the corn crib the night before, under guard, and near midnight, Aunt Sissy walked past the men, watching him as though they were not there. And they let her pass, because something in her face told them not to try her. She sat down outside the crib in the dirt, and she talked to the giant through the slats, low, for a long time. Nobody heard all of it, but little Reuben, who had crept out and hidden in the weeds to be near the man who carried him, heard some, and he carried it the rest of his long life. The boy said Aunt Sissy asked the giant plain what he was, and the giant was quiet a while, and then he told her he was only a man, but that a man who has swallowed enough grief becomes a door, and grief does not stay on one side of a door forever. He told her the water he had crossed to get to this country was full of the drowned, the ones thrown over the side of the ships, and that they had followed him the whole way, and they were tired, and they were owed. He said tomorrow the rope would open the door. Aunt Sissy did not run. She asked him only one thing. Would it know the difference between the guilty and the innocent? And Reuben said the giant turned his great head slow in the dark and looked at the old woman, and said that grief could count better than any judge that ever lived, that it would take exactly who it was owed, and not one soul more. Then he told her to keep the children close, and their faces turned toward the quarter, away from the tree, when the sun came up. Aunt Sissy went and did exactly that. The morning came up red. Old people always remember that. how the sky over the river went the color of a wound before the sun had properly risen, and how there was no wind at all, none, so that the moss hung dead still off the live oak, and the black water lay flat as a sheet of iron. The crowd gathered thick around the great tree at the bend of the road, hundreds of them, laughing and eating, and the enslaved were driven up in a line to watch and be taught. They brought Titus out in a wagon. 6 men could barely handle him even in chains. Though he did not fight them, he stepped down when they told him to, and the wagon rose 2 full inches when his weight left it. A moan went through the crowd when he stood to his height. Grown men who had come to cheer took a step back without knowing they had done it. He was a head and shoulders above the tallest man there, and he was calm. That was the thing none of them could stand. He looked out over that whole sea of faces the way you look at a field you are about to leave for the last time. Ambrose Devereux made his speech from a safe distance, his voice too high, his words all about order and law, and the wages of rebellion. Nobody really listened. They were all looking at the giant. They rolled a barrel under the biggest limb and stood him on it, and a man had to climb up on a second barrel just to reach high enough to fit the noose around that enormous neck. Titus let him. He kept his eyes on the quarter, on the far edge of the crowd, where the old conjure woman had gathered the children with their little faces all turned the wrong way, toward home, as he had asked. Devereux gave the signal. They kicked the barrel out from under him. The drop should have ended it. The crowd leaned in for the jerk and the stillness that always came. Instead, the whole tree screamed. The great limb bowed down under the giant's weight, like a bow bent to fire, the bark splitting with a sound like a gunshot, and the rope stretched and groaned, and then it snapped clean in two with a crack that rolled across the water and came back off the far bank like an answer. Titus dropped to the earth, and the ground jumped. For one heartbeat, the whole crowd stood frozen. And then the wind came. It came from nowhere, out of that dead still red morning, all at once, cold. A wind with no business in that country in that season. And it came off the river, carrying a sound underneath it. The old ones who were there swore to their dying day it was voices, many voices, low and wet and countless, the way a great crowd sounds heard through deep water. And every dog for a mile began to howl at the same instant. The giant rose. He rose slow, and as he rose, he pulled his arms apart, and the chains that had held him, chains made to hold 4 men, burst like rotten thread. He stood to his full height beneath the split and smoking limb, and he turned his face up to that red sky, and he opened his mouth, and what came out was not a man's voice. It was the sound the wind had been carrying. It was the sound of the drowned, and the door that Aunt Sissy had been warned about swung all the way open. What happened next has been told 1,000 ways over 170 years, and no 2 tellings agree, because no 2 people who were there could bear to remember it the same. But they agree on this much. The red sky went black at noon. The flat black water at the tree's roots began to move, and to rise, and things came up out of it. Shapes. The old people only ever called them shapes, standing in the shallows in their hundreds, dripping, patient, turned toward the crowd. And they agree that Merritt Cade, the overseer, was the first the door came for. He tried to run. He got as far as the road. The witnesses said the marsh itself reached up and took him, that the black water came over the dike where no water had ever come, and that when it went back down, there was no sign of him at all, not a boot, not a bone. The crowd broke then. Hundreds of people who had come laughing tore back down the river road in a screaming stampede, trampling the peddlers' stalls, the carriages overturning, horses drowning themselves in the marsh in their terror. And through all of it, the giant simply walked, unhurried, toward the big house, and the black water walked with him. But here is the part they told softest, the part that turned a horror story into something the people in the quarter held on to for the rest of their lives. The thing that came off that tree took Cade, and it took the men who had done the killing, and it took Ambrose Devereux out of his own locked house. But it never once touched a single soul from the quarter. The children stood at the tree line with their faces turned toward home, as Titus had asked, and the cold wind parted around them like a river around a stone. Grief, the giant had told the old woman, could count better than any judge that ever lived, and it counted true. It took exactly who it was owed, and not one soul more. By the time the black afternoon lifted, Devereux's plantation was finished. The big house stood with its doors hanging open, and no living white soul inside it. The rice fields had flooded over the dikes and gone back to marsh in a single tide, drowned so completely that within a year you could not tell there had ever been a field there at all. The great live oak at the bend of the road was split from crown to root and dead, though it never fell. It stood there black and bare for generations, and nothing green ever grew from it again. The men who came out from the town to investigate found the plantation empty, and the enslaved people simply standing in the quarter, unharmed, saying nothing. No bodies were ever recovered. Ambrose Devereux, Merritt Cade, and the men who had handled the rope were entered in the county book as lost, cause unknown, and the book was closed on them quickly, because nobody who had run down that road that day ever wanted the matter looked into too hard. As for the giant, he was never seen again in the daylight world, but he did not leave. The people of the quarter, and later the free people who farmed that ground and their children after them, all told the same thing. On certain nights, when the wind comes cold off the river out of season and the dogs go quiet all at once, you can see him, a shape taller than any man, standing where the black tree used to be, with the water gathered around his feet, watching the road, watching to see who comes. The river road past the bend became a road that people did not travel after dark, and they still don't. Not really. Not the old families. Travelers who did not know the story would come through and tell the same account in the morning, pale and unwilling to say much. That they had heard voices under the water, that a wind had come out of a still night, that they had felt, more than seen, something enormous keeping pace with them just off the road, patient, until they were past the dead tree. And then it was gone. It was never a story of a haunting, though. That is what the tellers always made sure to say. The thing on that road never harmed a soul who came to it with clean hands. Runaways moving north along the water in the years that followed spoke of a giant shape that stepped out of the marsh and stood between them and the men hunting them, and that the hunters' dogs would not cross, and the hunters themselves turned back, cursing and afraid. Old Reuben, the coughing boy, grown into a very old man, used to say he had walked that road at midnight without one moment's fear his whole life, because he knew whose road it was and whose side the thing on it was on. Grief had made a door of a man, and the door never fully closed. But it opened, the people always said, only one way. It opened for the drowned, and the beaten, and the hunted, and the Oid. And it shut like a wall of black water in the face of anyone who came down that road, believing that fear was stronger than a soul. Ambrose Devereux tried to make an example of Titus, so that his name would be spoken in fear for 20 miles. In a way, he got exactly what he wanted, and it buried him. The name that came off that tree and spread across the low country was not the name of the man who ordered the hanging. Nobody remembers Devereux. Nobody remembers Cade. But everybody still remembers the giant. The people who had the least reason in the world to believe in justice held on to this story hardest because it told them a truth the whole system was built to hide from them. That cruelty runs up a debt, and that debts in this world come to be paid, whether the men who owe them believe it or not. Aunt Sissy lived on for many years and never once claimed to have made any of it happen. She only said she had been given a warning and had been wise enough to listen. Keep the children close, she would tell the young mothers, and their faces turned toward home. You never know what morning the door will open. Nobody can tell you where Titus came from before the ship, or what his name was in the country that lost him. That was stolen along with everything else. But the low country gave him back a name, and it kept it, passed hand to hand and mouth to mouth, down through all the years until it reached this channel, and reached you tonight. Because that is the whole reason we are here. Some men leave behind more than bones. Some men leave behind a debt that gets paid, and a road that remembers, and a warning carried on a cold wind off the water. Do not mistake a quiet man for a broken one, and never, never believe that fear is stronger than a soul. That is the story of the giant they call Titus, and the morning the rope snapped and hell came down out of the tree with him. Thank you for walking down that dark road with us tonight, here on Shadows of Black History. If this story stayed with you, do us one kindness. Like this video and subscribe if you have not already, so we can keep giving these forgotten souls their names back. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the hour on your clock. It never stops amazing us how far into the night these stories reach. Remember, history is not only the things that were written down, it is the things that were whispered and buried and remembered anyway. Until the next story, keep your eyes open, keep the memory alive, and watch the road after dark.